Hello and welcome to everyone on the line. We're so glad you could join us for today's webinar, Global Cotton Production and Sourcing Trends. This event was organized by the United States Fashion Industry Association, representing brands, retailers, importers, and wholesalers based in the U.S. and doing business globally, as well as our friends at Cotton Incorporated. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our presenter today, Mark Missoura, Senior Vice President of Global Supply Chain Marketing at Cotton Incorporated. My name is Shannon Brady, Communications Coordinator at USFIA, and I will be your moderator. Please note that questions can be submitted at any time during the live program. Simply click on the question header on your webinar control panel, type your text into the box, and hit send. Our presenters will address as many questions as possible at the end of the program. If for some reason we experience a technical difficulty and lose audio, please refer to the chat box for further instructions. As a reminder, all registered participants will receive an email later today with a copy of the slide deck and a recording of today's session. So without further delay, I will hand the floor over to Mark.
Thank you, Shannon, and thanks to USFIA for partnering with Cotton Incorporated to allow us to bring this presentation to you today. We know this is a difficult time for everybody who is involved in the business, and it's a very difficult time for everyone's companies and their people and colleagues in the industry and their families. So I want to say right up front that we're pleased to be able to cooperate with USFIA and continue to provide this important information and service to all of you in the industry. And we at Cotton Incorporated will continue to do our best to help with information, training, technical support, and assistance. So again, thank you to Julie Hughes and Shannon and the whole staff at USFIA for this opportunity to partner with you today for this webinar. For those of you who are not familiar with Cotton Incorporated, let me just say that we are a private, not-for-profit organization. We're funded by U.S. cotton farmers and importers in the United States, importers of cotton. And our company is a great resource for all of you who are thinking about working in cotton or who have business in cotton. Our goal is to help you be profitable with your cotton business and to do it in the best way possible. Our company is involved in research and promotion. That's what we do. And we do that from the farm all the way through the consumer and the retail level. So we take a very comprehensive view to the information and the assistance that we can provide to all of you in the industry. Today's webinar will really be broken into two parts. The first part is going to talk about cotton production, answering the basic question, where does all that cotton come from? We'll spend some time examining cotton production, talking about where it's produced and how it's produced. And then we'll talk a little bit about trade, trying to understand the basic structure of trade, who exports cotton, who imports cotton, and how some of those trade issues are important as we think about the second part of this discussion today, and that's sourcing in cotton. We'll take our information from the first part of the webinar and what we've learned in the overview of production and trade, and we'll apply that to some thinking about some current issues in sourcing. Very specifically, how have some of the geographical sourcing patterns of cotton changed worldwide? And what does that mean for companies in the United States and members of USFIA? What does that mean in terms of what you should be thinking about as it relates to sourcing cotton as a raw material and understanding how to negotiate and follow cotton prices throughout the supply chain? So we'll talk about that for a little bit. Then we'll shift gears, talking still about sourcing, and I want to address the issue of traceability in cotton. We get a lot of questions about the topic of traceability, or more generally, how do I know where my cotton comes from? And there's a few key things that are really, really important for everyone to keep in mind. And we find ourselves educating a lot of companies about some very basic practical considerations. So we'll highlight a couple of those things and discuss those in the sourcing section. And finally, I want to reacquaint many of you, but introduce some of you to cottonworks.com. Cottonworks.com is the best all-encompassing resource for anybody doing anything with cotton. This is a free resource that's available online, and I'll show you specifically some of the things that are available through Cottonworks that relate to the topics and information that I'm going to cover in the webinar today. So with that, let's begin by talking about part one, cotton production. And any discussion of cotton production really has to start at the top. And that means looking at what we call the World Cotton Balance Sheet. And these columns and rows simply are just a visualization of supply and demand. The top two rows, beginning stocks and production, tell us in millions of tons the amount of inventory of cotton worldwide at the start of the marketing year. The production number tells us how much new crop or new growth of cotton is expected to be produced in that marketing year. The marketing year, you'll notice, is 2019-2020. In agriculture, the marketing year starts August 1st of 2019, and it continues all the way through the last day of July 2020. So we refer to that as the marketing year, and it corresponds with the cycle of crop production, and I'll show you a little bit of that later. So in this picture, in this table, what we can see is the supply of cotton. That supply is the 18.2 million tons of cotton that we're starting the marketing year with, and then the expectation that we're going to have about 26.5 million tons added to that. The yellow line that appears in the table is mill consumption. That's how many physical bales of cotton are opened in textile mills around the world. And you can see the number here is 25.7. So mill consumption is demand or use, the use of cotton. The difference between supply, the blue lines, and the demand or use, the yellow line, the difference is how much we have left over. That's the ending stocks number or ending inventory. That's projected to be 18.2 million tons. Now, for those of you in the business, you are familiar with your inventory to sales ratios. When you're watching the cotton market, you have the same type of ratio. We call that the stocks to use ratio. And that tells us the amount of inventory of world cotton divided by the mill consumption. So it's ending stocks divided by mill consumption. And that tells us, quite simply, whether the market is getting tight or loose. No different, again, than your inventory to sales ratio. And what you can see from last year to this year is that the ratio is going up from 66.6 to 70.6. When the ratio goes up, we tend to see prices going down. So overall, as we look at the cotton market, the situation is bigger supply, demand, mill consumption that lately was estimated at 25.7, but most people, and I think all of us would believe, this is going to go a little bit lower in the months ahead. What this means is softness or an increasing stocks-to-use ratio, rising up, meaning lots of inventory relative to demand, and that is associated with an outlook for weakness in prices. Let's move a little bit further now and take a closer look at world production. And here again, you see this in metric tons, millions of metric tons. This level of production, 26.5, would actually be the fifth largest level of world cotton production in history. We saw the record at 27.7 million metric tons a few years ago. So this is, by all historical standards, a very big crop. One of the key insights for those of you who are always looking at the sustainability perspective of cotton production and really all our raw materials, a very key insight about this high level of cotton production is that if you look back over the last 50 years, the amount of land planted in cotton worldwide has only increased by about 9%. But yet world cotton production over that very same period has increased by 121%. So one of the key things that this high level of world production is associated with is very little increase in land. It's actually as the result of a lot of technology that is being used and shared by farmers across the world. It's being shared through programs like the Better Cotton Initiative and the Cotton Leads effort that have open platforms for sharing technical information to help farmers. It's also been the situation where many of the world's cotton farmers have adopted biotech varieties, sometimes referred to as genetically modified seed varieties. And these varieties largely offer advantages in reducing chemical applications, improving yield, and have allowed farmers throughout the world to increase their yields, get more cotton per unit of land. So this is why we see really a small increase in planted land, but a huge increase in the world's ability to produce and supply cotton. And as you can see in this map here, if you look at major producers across the world, the percentage of land planted in biotech varieties is quite high. In fact, it's dominant in many countries around the world. Let's talk a little bit more about the big picture for cotton production. It truly is a global commodity. 77 countries grow cotton. And while we have a lot of countries that grow cotton, the production of cotton worldwide is actually quite concentrated. In fact, 3/4 of the world production of cotton really comes from just 5 countries. So lots of countries grow it, but a handful of countries provide the real large share of cotton. And you'll note that all 5 of these producers, of the world's largest producers, are countries where we have very high levels of GMO or genetically modified seed varieties used, which has allowed these countries to produce quite a bit more cotton on relatively the same amount or less land. Looking a little bit more in depth at the production side, we see these leading producers of cotton. India is the world's largest producer of cotton, as you can see here, with 6.4 million tons, followed by China at 5.9 million tons. It wasn't too long ago, just several years ago, that China was the largest and India was actually quite less than this. But again, the adoption of genetically modified varieties in India over the last 10 years or so has led to this dramatic increase in yields and the rise in production. The U.S. is the 3rd largest producer of cotton in the world, back quite a bit from the amounts we see coming out of India and China. Following the U.S. is Brazil at 2.8 million tons and Pakistan at 1.4 million tons. It's interesting to note here that both India and China produce more than the rest of the world combined, excluding the U.S., Brazil, and Pakistan. So really, again, a lot of countries that produce cotton, but the production of cotton is very concentrated in a handful of countries. What does that mean for all of you who follow raw materials prices and sourcing? It means that when you're watching the cotton market, we tend to watch these big producers. These are the ones that really have the ability to affect world prices because of their volumes. That doesn't mean that farmers and production in the rest of the world isn't important. It sure is. But what it means is, on a global scale, if you want to see what's happening in the cotton market or affecting prices, you really start with looking at what's going on in these 5 leading producing countries. And I'll show you a little later about how we keep up with that information for you. To understand production and perhaps apply that to your raw materials and sourcing discussions, it's always good to have knowledge of what we call the cotton calendar. This calendar is illustrated here. You can see the calendar year, January through December, and I've indicated here 2019, which is the start of obviously the calendar year, but from an agricultural standpoint, planting occurs in the spring, then we have the growth of the plant, the harvest period, and then that cotton comes to the market. We call that the new crop cotton. It's important in this picture also to note that this is for the northern hemisphere. Okay? About 90% of the world's cotton, 90% of it comes from the northern hemisphere. The other 10% is the southern hemisphere, producers like Brazil, Australia, South Africa, Argentina, Paraguay, and several others. But most of the world's cotton follows this timeline and this calendar. Once the cotton is harvested in the fall of the year, then we move into 2020, and that cotton is then sold and traded around the world. And that process continues until we repeat all over again the planting for the next year's crop, which starts in the spring. So right now we're April 1st, and farmers are planting in several countries and in the U.S. as well. And we're going to be going into this period of watching the cotton grow, and in the fall the harvest will begin. So we are in this period right now of early planting, but also shipping and trading cotton from last fall's harvest. Just a quick look at some of those important stages in the production of cotton. In this picture, you can see a variable rate cotton planter. This is typical of what's used in the United States, but in some other large producing countries as well. Farmers in the April time period and May and even into early June will be looking for adequate soil moisture, good temperatures, warm temperatures for those little baby cotton plants, and a favorable 5-day forecast. Seed is one of the most expensive elements of a producer's portfolio. So they want to make sure that it's warm enough and continues to be warm enough when they put out those seeds and the baby cotton plants start to emerge. At about 60 days, we tend to see flowering. And cotton plants, for those of you who've ever seen them, quite beautiful. And you see these flowers emerge, and on the first day they're a yellow, and then they become slightly white, and by the second day they turn pink, and then they fall off. And when they fall off, they leave the fruit of the cotton plant. That fruit is what we call the boll. The boll is that hard nut, if you will, that contains the lint, the fiber, and that's what we use in textiles, but it also contains the seed. And that seed is a valuable commodity for farmers throughout the world. It's crushed and the oil is used and the seed is used as feed for livestock. This tiny little fruit of the cotton plant, the boll, actually produces quite a bit of value that's used for clothing, textiles, and many, many other uses, including food products and animal feed. Harvesting is the phase that occurs in the fall. This is a picture of a cotton picker. This is a machine. There's a driver who's sitting in the cab of that machine. I show this to you because when you think about the cotton that's picked in 77 countries around the world, some of it is mechanized, picked by machine. But a lot of the cotton that's still harvested around the world, harvested in countries like India and Africa and parts of China and Turkey, it's still harvested by hand. So hand labor is still quite prevalent in a lot of countries. What determines whether a machine is used or whether it's picked by hand? The answer is really the size of the farm. For large-scale farms, it's more economical to use machines to pick the cotton. For small-scale farms, which you still have in a lot of countries, it's much more practical to use labor to pick the cotton. Once that cotton comes out of the field, it then goes to the ginning process, and this is a ginning machine. The first thing I want to tell you about this is this machine separates the seed from the lint. The lint is the fiber. But the second thing that's important to know from a sourcing standpoint is at this phase of cotton production, ginning practices and the process of ginning really does not vary around the world. The same types of gin machines are sold worldwide, much like fiber processing, yarn manufacturing, spinning machines. So even though we have cotton production in a lot of countries around the world, once you get to the ginning process, that process is pretty much the same worldwide. From ginning, you get the formation of bales. Bales are blocks of cotton. In this picture here, you can see bales in a U.S. warehouse. A U.S. bale is 500 pounds, but bales vary. You can see much smaller bales in India and China, bales that can be picked up by an individual or a couple of people. These larger bales in some countries are moved around by machines and forklifts. In this picture, you also see our beginning of our trade statistics. 71 different countries import cotton, which means that almost half the countries that use cotton in the world import it to some degree. And 61 different countries export cotton. If we go back to our map of our cotton calendar, here you can see the red line in the bottom in 2020, and that shows us where we are. So the cotton that's now in warehouses, just like the picture you just saw, is being delivered and sold around the world. That's the blue line in the cotton calendar. A couple of good points to note here for thinking about production, trade, and prices. We are seeing now the closure of mills and factories in places like India, Bangladesh, Turkey, and several other countries. That's the demand side of the market. So these mill deliveries of cotton are slated to go to those yarn spinners and fiber buyers around the world. So at this point in time, that red line, we're watching closely exports of last fall's harvest. And cotton prices in the marketplace today are really the function of two dominant factors. One, the outlook for exports and world consumption of cotton. That's that blue line. And then two, the early estimates of planting. That's the green line, or the green block there that says planting. And current world prices today are at 61.5. That means 61.5 cents per pound. That's the A index, which is the best proxy for a world price. But again, with the exports and the U.S. being the largest exporter in the world market, and us finding ourselves at that red line on the calendar, it means that market prices right now are being heavily influenced by the outlook for exports. So as mills around the world are closing down shop temporarily, that has created weakness in the cotton price, and we are watching closely to see if exports and sales of cotton are going to be affected in the weeks and the months ahead. The market is showing that effect, and we know that because the prices for U.S. cotton, the largest exporter in the world, those U.S. prices fell yesterday. The May contract price, that's cotton that will be delivered on this blue line in the month of May this year, that cotton is now, or as of yesterday, was at 52 cents. So, at 49 cents. It fell just below 50 cents. So we're looking at a weakness in prices, and we'll follow that for you. And I'll tell you a little bit later in the webinar how you can track those prices with our reports. So a little bit more on the production and trade side as we kind of finish section one. We see here a map showing the leading cotton exporters. The U.S. is the largest in the world and is also the most consistent supplier to the world market. The U.S. this year is expected to supply about 38% of all the cotton traded in the world, followed by Brazil at about 20% of the world share of trade. And then you see India at about 8%. That's followed by 4 countries that are at about 3% of the world total. That's Greece, Mali, Benin, and Australia. And Australia is an interesting case because they typically have a higher share in the world market, but because of the fires last year and exceptional drought occurring at the same time in Australia, the production of cotton in Australia is a fraction of what it normally is. Australia doesn't have much of a manufacturing base, So their production is actually largely exported to the world market. So in a normal year, Australia would have a higher share, but unfortunately, because of their production problems over the last year, they don't have a lot of cotton to sell into the world market. So they're a very relatively small supplier this year. Let's add to this picture Turkey, Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. And these countries are the largest importers of cotton. China and Bangladesh, followed by Vietnam, Turkey, and then Pakistan. So you can see that the first thing is just geographically, it really is the Asian continent that is the largest buyer of cotton in the world. And if you recall, the largest producers are China and India. So a lot of the world's production and use of cotton actually is centered on the Asian continent. With this little bit of background on production and trade, I want to shift our discussion now to some questions about sourcing cotton and use a little bit of this knowledge that we've just acquired. I want to use data from OTEXA, which is a great source to keep track of the imports and exports of textile products in and out of the U.S. And here I'm showing the share of millions of square meter equivalents of cotton apparel. What I've done in this table is I'm showing the relative shares by country of the leading suppliers of product into the U.S. So which companies are manufacturing, and then how much are they in terms of the share of millions of square meter equivalents, how much are they supplying to the U.S. market? In 2009, we see that China had 32% of all the cotton apparel that was exported to the U.S., and followed by Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so on down the line. What you see, though, if you compare this over the last 10 years, is the geographical shift in cotton sourcing. And while China is still the largest at 26.1% in 2019, year-end 2019, that share is significantly lower than it was 10 years ago. And this certainly reflects what we all see in the market, which is a movement out of China over the last several years. Still, China's the biggest, and I equate that to almost like the movement out of China is shaving 3 or 5 or 10 feet off the top of Mount Everest. Yes, it's moving to other countries, but China is still significant and large in the trade of cotton product. But what it means, though, is that this movement out of China now is an effort by a lot of brands and retailers to diversify their sourcing and move some of that cotton, if not all of that production, out of China. We expect to see that pattern continue as we work with a lot of companies to help them with their sourcing. If we look a little further down this table, we can see the emergence of Bangladesh and Vietnam. And their shares are significantly higher than they were a decade ago. Both of these countries now, Bangladesh and Vietnam, are leading importers of cotton. 10 years ago, they were a lot smaller in terms of imports of raw cotton. But as their industries have grown, so has the demand for raw material and for cotton fiber. One other one that I want to point out here is India. India is about 8% of the world total of exports. And you see here, though, as we said, it's a leader in world production. While its share has gone up from 6.1 to 7.0, the imports in India cover about 10% of their total mill use. And their exports of cotton have been going down. That's happened as their production has gone up, even though their consumption has gone up and their mill activity's gone up. But this is significant. So India is now exporting about 38% less in cotton than it did 5 years ago. So producing more, using more, but selling a lot less in the world market. So if we take a look at some of these leading cotton importers, we see something very interesting. On the far left, we see China. their production of cotton in blue. In brown, we see the amount of cotton that their mills are using. And then the green bar shows us the imports of raw cotton that go into China. So while China is still producing a lot of cotton, they're also a big importer to meet their needs for their textile mills and for their export business. At the far right on this chart, you see India. And here you see, again, production is very high in India, leading the world. Mill use is high, and they import a little bit of cotton to use for different types of products to get certain types of cotton. But this also means that they're not extremely dependent on imports. So the situation in India is interesting because it suggests that if you're sourcing from India, you should be looking at what kinds of cotton or origins of cotton those mills are using. And in India, they're going to tend to use a lot of Indian cotton, which means if you're following cotton prices, those mills will be buying off the domestic market, and you should be not looking at world prices for cotton. You should be following the Indian domestic prices for cotton to get an accurate sense of what your suppliers are really paying for their cotton. As we talk about connecting some of these sourcing shifts in cotton trade, I do want to point out something that's very interesting with Bangladesh and Vietnam. The shift that we've shown here about U.S. imports of apparel over the last 10 years, that shift has moved toward countries, Bangladesh and Vietnam, that are large importers of cotton from the world market. And the key insight and takeaway for all of you in raw material sourcing and negotiating with vendors in those locations is that these mills now are going to be very much dependent upon fluctuations in world prices because they're not insulated by the availability of domestic cotton supply. In other words, if you're sourcing from India and you're sourcing from China and even Pakistan, all three of those countries have a large domestic supply of cotton. And many of those mills will buy domestically and then supplement with imports. But the opposite is true when you deal with Bangladesh and Vietnam. They're buying off the world market. So if you're dealing with your suppliers in those countries, you need to understand that they are going to be much more susceptible to volatility or variations in world prices. They can't turn to any domestic supply. That has a couple of implications, the first of which I just said. They may be subject to more volatility. But the second thing is that you need to work with your mills and suppliers in those locations because typically they're not buying big inventories of cotton. That also means in a time like this when mills in Bangladesh are shutting down and you have to work with your suppliers very carefully to see if they're still getting the raw material inventory they may need when they start up business again. These mills in these countries are typically going to be buying hand to mouth and not keeping big inventories of raw material. So that's important to build into your sourcing strategy and your negotiations with suppliers in those regions. And this is a crazy picture that shows you a whole lot of lines. And there's two things to take away from this picture. One is that cotton prices vary. And you can see that by the up and down motion of these lines. But the second thing in this picture, denoted by the different colors, is that depending upon the origin of the cotton, where that cotton comes from, the prices can be very different. And your textile mills and yarn manufacturers around the world, they shop the market. They shop the market looking for different growths of cotton, different qualities of cotton that meet their needs. So I say this to you again because as you look at one of the insights from the shift in trade and imports with Bangladesh and Vietnam emerging, they will actively shop. Companies in those two countries will actively shop the world market for the different varieties they need. And in spinning, the cost of producing a pound of yarn, the raw material component of that can be anywhere from 60 to 75% of the cost of a pound of yarn. So even just a couple cents difference in the raw material price for cotton can have a big difference in the profitability of a yarn spinning operation. So again, The shift to those countries in Southeast Asia with more apparel manufacturing means that they're going to be more susceptible to movements up and down in world prices because they don't produce their own domestic supplies of cotton. So factor this into your strategies and your pricing oversight as you think about raw material costs moving through the chain and where you're sourcing from. Let me shift to the second topic in the second part of this webinar, and that's some practical considerations in sourcing. And here I want to address the concept of traceability and blending. And the question we get from a lot of companies is, when it comes to traceability, how do I know where my cotton comes from? Is there a way to know that? And is it important to know that? And the answer is, for a lot of companies, it depends on your sustainability strategy, your sourcing strategy, in terms of where you want to buy from or what programs you may be participating in for responsible production or sourcing. But regardless of those programs and those different types of initiatives, there are some basic things that companies still need to understand, and I see a lot of companies tripping up on this issue. So I want to take a moment and help clarify that. And that's the issue of blending. For example, let's take how cotton is produced in some different ways. Let's look at these two pictures, left and right. On the left side, you see an example of cotton that's harvested in a field. This happens to be in Arkansas in the United States. And that, what we call seed cotton, it's the cotton along with the seed is rolled up in this kind of big yellow Tootsie Roll. And that big yellow roll is labeled, and it has identification, as you can see with the RFID code there. And farmers can track where that cotton is coming from, that seed cotton, before it goes to the gin. And farmers who use this type of identification can even trace that cotton right to certain parts of a field. So there's good technology. That helps the farmers understand what parts of the field are producing well or may have lower or higher yields. So in several countries around the world that use these types of technologies, and this is used in Australia, this is common in Brazil too, these types of machines that allow farmers to label these rolls as they come out of the field. But for most cotton producing countries, China, India, certainly Turkey, and several others, the way cotton is collected is by a truck, and it's collected in mass. So in other words, the picture on the right shows us really big piles of cotton covered by a tarp or a canvas to protect them from the wind and, most importantly, from water and rain. And what this means, though, is these big piles of cotton are not one farm. They're a collection of cotton gathered from many, many different farms. So where you have countries like India, for example, which has large production, but lots and lots of small farms, you tend to get cotton that's put on the truck. Farmers are paid based on the weight of that cotton. And then the identity of that cotton, in terms of whose cotton it is, which farm it came from, is actually lost when all these cottons are combined into big piles like this. And this is a picture on the right from Uzbekistan, where they again aggregate this cotton. But I show these pictures to you because it's important to know that the identity of that cotton in many countries is actually lost because farmers are paid based on the weight of the cotton, and they're assessed on that when that cotton is collected and put on a truck and carried to a big storage facility like you see in the picture. The important concept for everyone to keep in mind is that because cotton is a natural material, when mills buy these bales and they put them in a warehouse, once that cotton is unwrapped and you take those bale covers off, you then put that cotton in what's called a laydown, and you can see a picture of that on the right. The cotton is in this long line. And those bales of cotton are rearranged and physically blended in manufacturing. The blending of cotton reduces variation. The blending of cotton allows yarn manufacturers to blend away big differences in fiber properties so that they get a more consistent yarn. That is the reality of manufacturing in cotton around the world. So this blending step is an absolutely critical part of production in cotton. It's common throughout the world, throughout manufacturing. But it also kind of works in an opposite direction from being able to identify sources of cotton or trace a particular bale. Now, I will qualify this by saying there are always exceptions. And a small producer producing a small amount of cotton apparel for a boutique collection or 10,000 units, can you identify the bales that go into that production? Absolutely. But if you're talking about tens of thousands of units or millions of units, that type of scale, or working with suppliers who are working with lots of customers and blending and making different types of yarns, this blending property and process is extremely common, and in many ways is a practical limitation or challenge to some of the efforts that many brands and retailers are seeking to trace cotton. The key point for companies to remember as you craft your strategy is that textile mills don't just buy tons or bales of cotton, they buy cotton based on fiber qualities. So if I'm a mill and I'm producing intimates, or if I'm a mill producing yarns for denim, I need very different physical qualities of cotton. And buying those qualities affects my profitability and the price I pay for my raw material. So it's not just a bale of cotton or a ton of cotton. It's actually buying specific qualities to meet an engineered product. That is a key point that companies need to keep in mind. I do see companies sometimes forgetting this point and thinking that we can just source cotton. But really, you got to work with your suppliers to make sure they can meet what you're sourcing for, your goals, but also keep in mind that ultimately they have to get the qualities that they need. The last point I want to touch in the webinar before we open up for questions is the best resource available to you, all of you in the industry, and that's cottonworks.com. This is the online platform through Cotton Incorporated, brought to everyone through our importer support program at Cotton Incorporated and the Cotton Board. And this resource, as you can see here, covers a tremendous amount of information, assistance, training, information, videos, explanations, all sorts of things to help you with your business. And I want to highlight a few elements of this site that are particularly germane to our conversation in this webinar today. The first is if you go into the topics on CottonWorks, and when you do that, if you're not familiar with the site, it'll ask you to register. Registration is free, so everyone should be able to access that. And if you pull down in topics, you see fiber science among many different topics that are offered. Going a little further into the fiber science page, you see all sorts of information, more detail than I've provided today. So if you're interested in following up on the aspects of harvesting and cotton classification, I encourage you to check this out. In particular, if you look at this section featuring one of the USDA employees at the Memphis Classing Office, Byron Cole, we see cotton fiber qualities and evaluation. And if you click there, you'll see an explanation of what this area is, but you'll also see the ability to download the Cotton Fiber Development and Processing book. And that's what this book looks like. This is perhaps, I think, one of the best resources available to anybody working or sourcing with cotton, and that's this Classification of Cotton book. This book was a joint effort by Cotton Incorporated and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to pull essential information to help companies understand a lot of different aspects of classification and fiber properties. You can see from the table of contents here, there's a lot of information covered in this very brief handout. These pages here are just examples of things like color grade or even micronair, essential physical properties of cotton that are important in manufacturing a wide range of products. So I encourage everyone who's interested in the fiber quality issue, the fiber properties, to go on to CottonWorks and look at this and download the Classification of Cotton booklet. The second item I wanted to reference, again, in CottonWorks, if you go to the news header, and you see that along the top bar, In this news header, we're always pointing out the adoptions of technologies and new introductions of really innovative cotton products into the market by many different brands and retailers. But you can scroll down and you will find on this page our monthly economic letter. And today I talked a little bit about pricing, and I gave you some of the fundamentals of supply and demand. Well, if you want to keep up with that information, we have a terrific economist here at Cotton Incorporated, John Devine. And each month, John does a tremendous service for the industry by taking the latest estimates that are produced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, looking at supply and demand and prices. And John presents that in his monthly economic letter, which you can get every month at Cotton Works. And this letter goes into the latest estimates, how things are changing, but also helps you in raw materials and sourcing follow the price trends. And John in this letter also does a great job of explaining why the prices are changing and what is the outlook. So that's really, really key, and I would encourage everyone, especially in these times, as we're seeing pricing and consumption in mills changing daily. Stay up with what's going on in the cotton market, and this is the best way to do it through our Cotton Incorporated's monthly economic letter available in Cotton Works. Another recent addition to our resources is an ebook for classification and tariff engineering. And tariff engineering, very broadly, is this concept of how can companies evaluate the design or fiber content of products that they're importing, and how might they alter that in ways that then reduce the total cost of that product. This is a great concept for sourcing companies to look at, and designers and sourcing people in companies to coordinate. We had the benefit of working with two experts in the industry, well-known, Janet Idaboy and Sonia Chapman, who are true experts in this topic. And they put together this wonderful booklet that looks at classification and tariff engineering. And it explains the classification system. It also goes into great detail to help companies think about insights for how they can alter their products or vary the rate of fibers to get the best duty rates, and ultimately improve the profitability of the cotton products that you're bringing into the U.S. market. There are plenty of examples, too, throughout this book of ways designers can make slight modifications to a product that may improve and substantially lower their duty rate. So this is a great book, and I'd encourage everyone to go on and download this and to look at this, share this with your product development and sourcing teams. And if you're not already taking advantage of some of these insights, please do so. This is a great way to improve the profitability of your cotton products. So with that, I want to encourage everyone to explore the Cotton Works site. Today, we didn't get into some topics like sustainability, recycling, circularity, biodegradability. All of these aspects of cotton are covered, and information is available through Cotton Works, as well as information about our trend forecasts, and even the ability to source fabrics and select samples of inspirational cotton fabrics and technical innovations. So again, I encourage you to make use of this resource for things even beyond the content and the range of our topics today in the webinar. So with that, I want to again thank the USFIA for partnering with Cotton Incorporated, allowing us to do this with that tremendous organization and bring this information to you. And at this time, I will turn the program over and we will take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. As Mark said, we are going to turn the floor over to our audience right now for questions. We're going to start with those submitted during the live presentation, but we encourage everyone to continue submitting questions using your dashboard. For the first question, Mark, can you give any perspective on why the African continent is not among the leading producers of cotton apparel?
Two thoughts. First, I want to distinguish in this question whether the question is about whether Africa as a continent whether they're referring to the production of apparel or whether they're talking about the production of raw cotton. Let me first address raw cotton. Africa has many countries that produce cotton, from Egypt and South Africa to a band of countries in the northwest part of the continent. We refer to that as the African Franc Zone, which includes countries like Cameroon, Benin, Mali, and Cote d'Ivoire. These are cotton-producing countries. They, for a long time, have had typically lower yields, less access to genetically modified seed varieties and other kinds of things. There have been great efforts, as I've said earlier. One of the beauties of worldwide cotton is that information that can help farmers in countries is shared openly and broadly. And there's a lot of technical information that's been shared with farmers in Africa to improve their yield and improve their practices, and that's terrific. On the production of apparel side, I'm going to leave that actually to the experts in apparel sourcing, and to say that there are probably several reasons why perhaps both physically, geographically, and politically apparel production isn't larger in Africa. But I will say that, of course, we've seen quite a bit of investment in the last few years in countries like Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, for manufacturing. So let's see if in the next 10-year evaluation, we see African countries jumping into that top 10 list.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And for the next question, as Chinese companies branch out into other countries, do you have any numbers on Chinese corporate ownership versus cotton that is produced in China?
That's a very insightful question. Certainly, there's a flow of capital, and while we don't have specific numbers, we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence, and to be sure it's real. There has been a flow of Chinese capital, money from owners of factories in China to locations outside of China, encouraging investment. We see a lot of that in regions that I just named, like Eastern Africa. We see Chinese capital also flowing into markets like Vietnam. And in fact, Vietnam surging as an importer of raw cotton, but also getting a lot of yarn, and that yarn being spun in Vietnam and moved back into China too. So a lot of cross-border flow there. We do see investments by Chinese firms even in locations like Turkey. So Chinese capital in apparel manufacturing, yarn production is fluid, and it has moved to locations around the globe.
Thanks, Mark. The next question is, with the impact of COVID-19 on business operations, do you anticipate that there will be a tougher impact on cotton production in China, India, and Brazil than here in the U.S.?
I think I would answer that by saying we're all waiting, all of us, to see what the impact is of this health situation, certainly the global health situation, on people everywhere. What's interesting, if you go back to the cotton calendar that I showed you, is that most of the world's cotton is being planted right now. And in terms of production and the impact on farmers in China and India and Turkey and Africa and in the United States, we're going to be able to see how those plantings and farmers are affected really in the next month or two, because that's when they're putting the cotton in the ground. That's when they're planting. Countries like Australia, Brazil, South Africa, Argentina, the impact on those cotton farmers, we won't see that really till next fall, because that's the time when they start planting. So farmers in those southern hemisphere countries are going to be able to see what market prices are in cotton. If cotton prices collapse, if they fall relative to other commodities like soybeans, corn, or wheat, then you'll see farmers shift out of cotton and plant more of those other things. Farmers in countries around the world, from Brazil to Turkey to the United States, China, they look at cotton, but they are farmers who look at all different types of planting options. And to the extent their land and their ecosystems allow them to switch among different crops, they'll look at market prices. So the short answer is we'll know in the Northern Hemisphere in the next 6 weeks, as farmers are in that planting cycle, as we saw on the cotton calendar. Longer term, the Southern Hemisphere, which is about 10% of the world's production, will be planted in the fall. So we're going to know in the next 6 or 8 weeks how much world cotton is really going to be affected and how farmers will be affected.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. The next question, what is the definition of organic cotton, and can it be distinguished from non-organic cotton when used in end-use products?
The best definition of organically produced cotton is really and most clearly defined by the National Organic Program of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I would refer everyone who's interested in knowing what qualifies as organically produced to go onto that site and take a look. Again, that's the U.S. Department of Agriculture National Organic Program. But the short, concise definition is really organic cotton is not a different cotton. It's a different way of growing the cotton. So in organically produced cotton, you still have fertilizers, you can still have insecticides, pesticides, the chemicals are used. The difference is under the National Organic Program, those types of chemicals have to be derived from natural materials, natural sources. They can't be synthetically produced. So that's the key difference. The second thing that's different is in organically produced cotton, you are not allowed, again, under the USDA rules, to use seed varieties that are genetically engineered or genetically modified. So those are the two major factors that define what is organically produced cotton. With respect to identifying it, if you had two samples of cotton in your hands, one that was organically produced and one that was genetically modified or conventional, meaning not organic but not using biotech seeds, you could not physically tell the difference between these samples of cotton. Now, there are companies that are marketing technologies that claim to do that, and I would encourage anybody who's interested to contact those companies and have them explain the technologies and ask how they will do that or how they claim to do that. But again, the key point is there's no physical difference in the cotton. Genetically modified cotton is not longer, stronger, or softer. Neither is organically produced cotton. Those properties are a function of how the yarn is made and how the fabric is made and how it's finished. It has nothing to do, those types of properties have nothing to do with how the cotton is grown.
Thank you, Mark. For the next question, you mentioned in your presentation the challenges in tracing cotton to the farm it was grown. If you take an area where there are small farms, like in China, following the cotton laydown and blending, is it possible to trace cotton to a specific region?
It is possible. It's a good question. It is possible for companies if they establish a chain of custody. Right now, that's probably the most reliable way to do it, is to have some type of chain of custody that can be documented or guaranteed. There are organizations like GOTS that do it for organically produced cotton, and they do a terrific job with that. So there are ways to do that with a physical chain of custody. But again, once you get into manufacturing, unless you're standing over those cottons and you see that cotton go into the product that's being made in the mill, you have to assume, especially with large volumes, that those cottons are going to be blended.
Thanks, Mark. Our next question is, when mass cotton is blended with traceable cotton, does the blending process make it harder to trace?
The answer to that question, I guess, depends on what are you defining as traceable cotton. If you know that cotton came from Susie's farm and Cheryl's farm, and it's blended with cotton from 30 other farmers, yes, it's very difficult to say, yes, this is Susie or Cheryl's cotton, because it's blended, again, in manufacturing. And you can have laydowns, arrangements of bales that may be 40 to 80 bales. And again, those laydowns, those physical arrangements on the manufacturing floor are determined by the fiber properties. And you want to blend and arrange those bales so that you're mixing the cottons as you pull the fiber and then blending it into the yarn. So the basic rule would be the bigger your blending operation, the bigger your volume of cotton, the harder it may be to identify sources or origins.
Thanks, Mark. And we will take one more question before we conclude today. You mentioned that sourcing cotton is really about mills buying fiber qualities. As a retailer, should I be concerned about buying fiber qualities in my product?
Oh, that's a very good question. My advice to retailers and brands is work with your yarn suppliers so that you understand how raw material costs are changing. Certainly, work with them to make sure they're sourcing cotton according to whatever sourcing or sustainable sourcing plan you have in place. But just make sure that you're giving them latitude, flexibility to get the qualities they need. If you direct them to source only these cottons, and those cottons from that particular source or a farm or a region don't produce the qualities they need to make your product, then they have a problem. Then you're forcing your suppliers to maybe use physical cotton that doesn't meet ultimately the product you want them producing and you want to be selling to your customer. So my advice would be not to get into, as a retailer or brand, do not get into managing fiber properties, but make sure your sourcing strategy is sufficiently flexible to allow your mills and your supply chain to get the qualities they need, which may be in big supply or short supply in different years, different seasons. But make sure you're giving them that flexibility in your sourcing directives so that they can get the qualities they need to make your product. It also, as I showed you today, affects very much the price they pay for raw material. And if they can trade off some of these qualities and actually reduce the cost of the material, that's good for them, and you still get a great product. So you don't want to, I would argue, over-engineer your directives to mills. Let them have that flexibility and work with them on broad sourcing guidelines for cottons that they use.
Thank you, Mark. And on that note, we're going to conclude today's webinar. As a quick reminder, all attendees will receive a follow-up email containing the slide deck and a recording from today's program. Please do not hesitate to reach out with any additional questions. You can always contact USFIA directly by emailing us at info@usfashionindustry.com. Thank you again for joining us and Mark for a wonderful presentation, and we look forward to hosting you at the next USFIA event.